Everybody remembers the clean version of the West, a dusty street, two men facing off, one quick shot, justice served before sunset. That wasn't the West. The real frontier smelled like sweat, blood, and something far worse. And the first truth Hollywood quietly cut was how entertainment and death often stood side by side. When a hanging was announced, towns didn't hide indoors. They gathered. Families arrived in wagons before sunrise. Vendors sold pies and whiskey. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. It felt less like justice and more like a county fair. The condemned man would stand on a wooden platform, rope scratching his neck, eyes scanning a crowd that had come not to mourn, but to watch. When the trapdoor dropped, cheers sometimes followed, and when the body stopped twitching, it wasn't always taken down. In some towns, corpses were left hanging for days. A warning, a spectacle. Hollywood shows the rope. It never shows the smell. And justice? It was often rushed, fueled by politics, grudges, or fear, not evidence. The Old West wasn't built by hardened men alone. It was filled with boys trying to survive too fast. Teenagers carried revolvers like school books. Some were barely 16. A few even younger. They worked cattle drives, guarded saloons, rode with outlaw gangs. Childhood ended the moment a pistol touched their palm. In mining towns and rail camps, disputes didn't wait for maturity. A harsh word, a shove, a draw, and when the smoke cleared, the body on the dirt street was often someone who hadn't even grown a full beard. Hollywood casts seasoned heroes. The truth? The frontier swallowed boys and called them men. Tooth pain on the frontier wasn't inconvenience. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. There were no sterile rooms, no gentle procedures. A man would sit in a wooden chair, a bottle of whiskey passed into his shaking hand. Another man, sometimes not even a trained dentist, would step forward with pliers. No anesthesia, no numbing agents, just grit and alcohol. The tooth would be gripped, twisted, ripped free. Sometimes it shattered, leaving fragments behind. Infection followed, swelling, fever, blood poisoning. People didn't just lose teeth. They lost their lives to something modern society fixes in an afternoon. The West wasn't just violent from bullets. It was violent from neglect. Gold rush towns rose overnight, and wherever gold appeared, so did business. Brothels weren't hidden in shadows. They stood brightly lit, organized, structured. Ledgers tracked earnings. Schedules rotated workers. Protection money was negotiated carefully. Some even had dress codes and rules stricter than the saloons next door. Behind the scenes, investors, respectable businessmen, bankers, even town officials, quietly funded them. Publicly, they preached morality. Privately, they collected profits. The West loved to pretend vice was wild and uncontrolled. In truth, it was managed like an enterprise, and many of the town's honorable citizens were shareholders. In gold country, land meant survival. A few feet could mean fortune or starvation. If a miner discovered gold and marked his claim, that small wooden sign was supposed to protect him. But protection only works when law exists. Claim jumpers waited for opportunity. A lonely prospector, a quiet canyon, a night without witnesses. Arguments were short, shots were quicker. There were no courtrooms deep in the hills, no judges, no juries, just shallow graves dug in rocky soil. By the time anyone noticed a man missing, someone else was already working his land. In the Old West, ownership often belonged to whoever was still breathing. Sometimes killing wasn't enough. In lawless stretches of territory, bodies were displayed deliberately, hung from bridges, left at crossroads, slumped against fences. A sign would be pinned to the chest: horse thief, rustler, traitor. Whether the accusation was true didn't always matter. The message was clear. This is what happens. Yet it was psychological warfare long before modern tactics had names. Fear traveled faster than law enforcement ever could. Hollywood gives us quick burials and quiet dignity. Reality left corpses swaying in the wind as a lesson. Textbooks talk about hunting. The frontier practiced extermination. As railroads expanded across the plains, buffalo were killed not just for food, but for sport, for hides, for strategy. Hunters shot them from moving trains. Piles of carcasses were left to rot under the sun. Mountains of skulls rose like monuments to waste. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Indigenous tribes who depended on buffalo for survival faced starvation as herds vanished almost overnight. This wasn't survival. It was industrial destruction. And it changed the balance of the continent forever. If you were shot, crushed in a mine, or mangled by machinery, survival depended less on courage and more on luck. Frontier hospitals were crude buildings with limited supplies. Surgical tools were reused without proper cleaning. Water wasn't always boiled. Bandages were scarce. Amputation was common. A shattered limb meant a saw. Infection was almost guaranteed. Patients often survived the bullet, only to die days later from fever and rot. Doctors worked with what they had. But what they had wasn't much. The West didn't just kill in the streets, it killed in recovery rooms. When towns felt threatened, they didn't always wait for official law. They formed committees, vigilance groups, self-appointed judges. Evidence was optional. Rumors were enough. A man accused of theft could be dragged from his bed before sunrise. A quick vote. A rope thrown over a beam. No appeals. No defense. Sometimes years later, proof surfaced that the wrong man had been executed, but the frontier didn't reverse decisions. Mob rule filled the gaps where institutions failed. Justice was fast, final, and often wrong. The most haunting truth isn't one dramatic gunfight. It's the silence. Smallpox outbreaks swept through settlements and tribal lands alike. Mining explosions buried dozens alive. Railroad workers were caught in avalanches and tunnel collapses. Many were buried where they fell. No markers, no names carved in stone, just unmarked earth covering lives that built towns, laid tracks, and dug fortunes they would never see. History remembers legends. The frontier was built on the forgotten. By now you've seen the blood. But violence alone doesn't explain the Old West. Chaos didn't just happen, it was shaped, directed, profited from. Because behind every dusty gunfight and hanging rope, there was something even more powerful than a revolver. Money. And once you follow the money, the West starts to look less wild and far more controlled. The railroad didn't just connect America, it controlled it. Railroad corporations were granted millions of acres of land by the federal government, but that wasn't enough. Executives bribed lawmakers, pressured governors, and influenced local sheriffs to protect their interests. If a farmer refused to sell land cheaply, legal notices appeared, taxes increased, access roads disappeared, court cases conveniently favored the rail lines. To the public, it looked like progress. Behind closed doors, it was leverage. The iron tracks didn't just cross the country, they tightened around it. When industrial barons faced strikes or protests, they didn't always call the sheriff. They called the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. By now, the pattern is clear. The Old West wasn't just violent. It wasn't just corrupt. It was rewritten. And that rewriting may be the most powerful weapon of all. Long after the gunfire faded, storytellers stepped in. Dime novel writers turned outlaws into rebels. Traveling shows dramatized battles. Early filmmakers polished rough edges and painted morality in simple colors, white hats and black hats. Complex conflicts became simple duels. Corporate greed became rugged individualism. Public hangings became honorable justice. The dirt was washed off. The politics softened. The bodies reduced to background noise. Audiences didn't want disease, corruption, or children dying in mining camps. They wanted heroes riding into sunsets. So the West was cleaned for consumption. And once a myth is repeated enough times, it stops feeling like fiction. It starts feeling like memory. History books say the frontier closed in 1890. But frontiers don't disappear. They evolve. The revolver became a contract. The saloon became a boardroom. The land grab became a merger. The railroad baron became the corporate executive. Control of territory turned into control of markets. Control of gold turned into control of information. The same questions still echo. Who writes the rules? Who enforces them? Who profits when chaos settles? The setting changed. The stakes did not. Well, the Old West didn't vanish. It moved. When you strip away the romance, the Old West was not a playground of freedom. It was a battleground of survival and power. Some men wore badges. Some wore bandanas. Some wore tailored suits and signed documents that carried more force than any bullet. Hollywood gave us legends. Reality gives us lessons. The frontier wasn't about good versus evil. It was about who controlled land, labor, and law. And if you look closely at today's headlines, at corporate battles, political influence, economic power, you might notice something familiar. Different clothes, different weapons. Same game. So tell me, which of these banned truths shocked you the most? Drop the number in the comments. If you want more stories Hollywood refused to show, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because next time, we're uncovering the Old West myths that were completely fabricated and the real stories hiding underneath them. Until then, remember, reality doesn't fade into the sunset. It just waits to be rediscovered. Armed agents arrived by train or boat, carrying rifles and authority backed not by voters, but by wealth. During labor disputes, they guarded factories, escorted strikebreakers, and sometimes exchanged gunfire with workers demanding fair wages. To businessmen, they were protection. To laborers, they were an invading force. It raised a question that still echoes today. When money can hire its own army, who truly controls the law? Cattle barons and small ranchers didn't just argue over grazing land, they went to war. In the places like Wyoming, powerful ranch owners formed associations. They created lists of alleged rustlers, often without proof. They hired gunmen to eliminate threats. But here's what rarely makes the movie script. Many of these operations were financed by Eastern banks. Loans flowed to the biggest players. Violence protected investments. This wasn't random frontier fighting. It was business strategy enforced with bullets. In some territories, judges owed their positions to wealthy backers. A rancher accused of murder might walk free. A poor homesteader accused of theft might hang. Juries were influenced. Witnesses intimidated. Sheriffs quietly reminded where their funding came from. Trials were held, yes, but outcomes often seemed decided long before the gavel struck. The West prided itself on rough justice. In reality, justice frequently wore a price tag. After treaties were signed and broken, land was open to development. Mines expanded, ranches grew, railroads advanced. Indigenous communities were pushed into debt systems. Some were forced into low-paying labor under harsh conditions. Payment was inconsistent. Contracts were manipulated. Entire towns prospered, while the original inhabitants were cornered into survival work on what had once been their own land. Hollywood frames expansion as destiny. The truth is harsher. Prosperity for some meant displacement for others. Stagecoach robberies became legendary, masked bandits, dramatic chases. But sometimes, the theft was an inside job. Business owners quietly ensured valuable shipments. Well, when money disappeared during transport, investigations often stalled in remote territory. A robbery could mean payout without accountability. Not every outlaw wore a bandana. Some wore suits and filed paperwork. And in the confusion of the frontier, fraud blended easily with folklore. The Old West didn't just have guns, it had headlines. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers. Editors exaggerated shootouts, invented rivalries, and polished reputations. A minor scuffle became a legendary duel. A petty criminal became a folk hero. Some gunfighters gained fame not from skill, but from ink. The myth machine started long before Hollywood. By the time films were made decades later, the groundwork had already been laid by sensational journalism hungry for sales. Truth didn't always sell. Drama did. Unconvicted criminals didn't always sit in cells. They worked. Chain gangs broke rocks under the sun. Prisoners laid track, dug ditches, and cleared land. Conditions were brutal. Guards enforced discipline with force. Food was minimal. Medical care almost non-existent. Sentences could stretch longer than promised. Complaints rarely reached sympathetic ears. Labor reduced costs for expanding industries. Punishment and profit walked hand in hand. And once again, survival depended less on innocence and more on influence. Thousands of Chinese laborers worked on the most dangerous stretches of Western rail construction. They blasted tunnels through granite mountains. They hung from cliffs to place dynamite. They faced avalanches and freezing winters. When snowstorms buried camps, some workers were never recovered. Pay was lower than that of white laborers. Recognition was scarce. When the final spike was driven to celebrate completion, many of the men who made it possible stood off to the side, or weren't invited at all. Their labor built the backbone of expansion. Their names rarely appeared in history books. In some towns, accusation alone could be fatal. A rumor spread. A crowd gathered. A rope was found. No formal charge. No defense. No evidence examined carefully. Lynching became a tool of intimidation, especially against minorities and immigrants. It wasn't justice. It was control. And it sent a clear message about who held power and who did not. Hollywood avoids this side of the West because it strips away heroism. It reveals something colder. By now you can see it. The West wasn't pure chaos. It was controlled chaos. Money steered violence. Power shaped justice. Reputation masked corruption. And if survival defined the surface of the frontier, control defined what lay underneath.